Here's two things that are true about me. I'm pro-life and I vote pro-choice. Now, the way that the abortion issue is constructed in the United States these days, that might seem like some kind of a contradiction. It's the argument of this video that it isn't.
The problem arises because current conversations about abortion contain a false dichotomy. Each position contains two separate claims, and it blurs the distinction between them. When we talk about pro-life, we include both the claim that abortion is morally costly and also the claim that abortion should be banned. And when we talk about pro-choice, we include both the claim that abortion should be legal and that abortion is not morally costly. Of course, I should include a caveat that some people are more sophisticated about these claims. I'm trying to talk about the dominant themes, especially in American politics today. The problem is that these claims are claims about ethics, and these claims are claims about politics. And while ethics and politics inform each other, they're not the same thing. If we're careful to maintain this distinction, we can see that another view will emerge. This view, my view, which is pro-life in its ethics and pro-choice in its politics. I will argue that this hybrid view is not only coherent, but attractive. It's the view that I personally hold. I'm pro-life enough that I have a family with 7 children, and pro-choice enough that I think we shouldn't be implementing bans or severe restrictions on abortion. Here's an overview of what I'm trying to accomplish. We're going to start out by talking about ethics. I think there's actually a lot of common ground between people across the board that gets lost in all the heat of this discussion. We're going to focus on that first. Then we will dig into the controversy. I'm going to argue that this debate is as persistent as it is because it's rooted in some very deep and very hard philosophical problems that don't lend themselves to simple solutions. Then we'll move on to talk about politics. I'll focus, first of all, on what the pro-life movement has tried to do and why we shouldn't be doing it, and second of all, on what we should be doing instead. Before I go any further, I do want to recognize that I'm yet another man speaking about what is obviously a woman's issue. And look, I get it. As you'll see towards the end of the video, I'm going to suggest that one of the things we must be doing is paying more attention to the voices of women, especially those who are choosing to have abortion. This is a video, for better or worse, about the internal logic of the pro-life movement and how I think it can have different political implications than it's usually thought to have. That's something I hope can contribute helpfully to the larger conversations we're all having about abortion. We'll see. Let's begin by looking for some common ground. Here's something I think everybody believes. Some killings have a higher moral cost than others. Now, you might have noticed when I first defined my terms that I'm using this phrase morally costly rather than morally wrong. That's because ethics is complicated. When you say that something is morally wrong, it tends to imply that it's always morally wrong. And when you say that it's not wrong, it tends to imply that it's always permitted. And that's not usually the case. So what I'm using here is these comparative terms, more or less morally costly. And that's just meant to indicate that some kinds of actions take better reasons to justify them than others. Things with a low moral cost will be easy to justify. Things with a high moral cost will be difficult. The ethics of abortion is among many issues involved in the ethics of killing. There is a living thing involved, multiple living things involved, and we're asking questions about whether or not it is okay to kill that living thing or for what reasons we might be permitted to kill that living thing. This is a standard and big issue in philosophy, and all I'm trying to say here is that we can rank, to some extent, killings. Consider a range of cases: bacteria, plants, fish, dogs, humans. Everybody thinks it's easier to justify the death of bacteria than it is to justify the death of humans. Furthermore, we tend to agree about why. As the complexity, awareness, and intentionality of things gets higher and higher, so does the moral cost of killing them. I think that's also in the common ground. The more complex, aware, and intentional a thing is, the greater the moral cost of killing it. All right. So I think this is a fairly non-controversial claim. Remember, as long as we're focusing on rankings and not absolute right and wrong judgments. So even if you believe that a dog has a very strong right to life or a fish has a very strong right to life, you could still believe that it's worse to crash your airplane into a room full of dogs or a room full of humans than it is to crash your airplane into a tank full of fish. Yes? And I think by and large, we do believe that. We do rank this way. We behave we behave consistently with this ranking. This explains the ranking of our behaviors in the actual world. So for the rest of this talk, we're going to focus on just
humans. I'm going to bring non-humans in at a couple of different points, but this is fundamentally about when it might be permitted to kill some kind of human entity. I'm by and large not going to be talking about evildoers. That's a whole separate set of issues. It's of course related to the issues we're talking about. Maybe someday I'll release other videos that gets into the ethics of killing evildoers, but that's not what we're going to do here today. We're going to be talking about just ordinary, nice old folk. And I want you to assume that this person is whoever you want it to be. It can be you. I'm going to speak about it as though it is me, and that these are different stages in my life. So here's the next piece of the common ground that I want to develop. The killings of each of these different stages of an individual are also not equivalent. In fact, there is an increase in the severity, the moral cost of death, the further back you go in the history of the being. So the further back you go in time and in development, there is less age and there's more deprivation. So the standard view about what makes death bad for people in philosophy is that they are deprived of their future experiences, right? So the reason that I don't want to die now is because I have hopes and dreams and plans and purposes that would go unfulfilled if I did. That's at least part of what makes it wrong when you kill me. It's part of what explains why, if we hear that there's a mass shooting, we would be a little bit relieved if we heard that it was in a retirement community as opposed to if we heard that it was in a kindergarten. It's of course possible that all of these killings are very bad, but we can still rank them comparatively. Some of them can be worse than others. And so common ground number 3 is just that all other things being equal, it's more costly for a young person to die than an old one. So if we take a ranking like this, these are going to be, by and large, the worst among those deaths. And typically this is how we actually treat them. We usually do treat the death of very young people as sadder, more tragic, more to be avoided than the death of the elderly. Now, you can't go back that way forever though, because if you go back far enough, then you run out of me. You run out of the individual that we're talking about. So there's at least a theoretical limit on how far back in the history of a thing you can go and still have it be serious moral cost. So the unjoined sperm egg set that existed prior to conception, right? So go like a day before I was conceived. There was a sperm inside my dad and there was an egg inside my mom. That's the sperm that would eventually join to become me. But just considering those two things as separate entities, I didn't exist yet, and it wouldn't have been a great tragedy if that sperm or that egg had been destroyed. Contrary to the very clever Monty Python song, nobody believes that every sperm is sacred. So that gets us into this messy terrain of what happens from the time before conception to the time when we get to infancy. We're going to have to talk about pregnancy. And you might think, okay, now we're into the controversy. And I think we're not quite there yet. I think there's at least one more thing that we can point out in the common ground. So here's the 3 principles I've been working with. Some killings have a higher moral cost than others. The more complex, aware, and intentional a thing is, the greater the moral cost of killing it. And all other things being equal, it's more costly for a young person to die than an old one. I want to return to this second principle for a minute. The more complex, aware, and intentional a thing is, the greater the moral cost of killing it. And then look at the different stages of pregnancy. So pregnancy usually lasts 9 months. These different icons represent that more or less accurately. Please don't take this to be a biology textbook on fetal development. There's plenty of those already. So here's something that I think is also in the common ground. So when we're talking about the moral cost of abortion, there is also a comparative ranking. Pretty much everybody agrees that abortions in the early stages of pregnancy are less serious than abortions towards the end. You can think they're all wrong, but still that late-term abortions are worse. And this, I think, does in fact predict the behavior that we see, that people are more concerned to prevent late-term abortions than they are to prevent early ones. So we can relate this to the principle that we talked about earlier, because the fetus is developing in complexity, awareness, and intentionality as it goes through that process, which will then just call our attention to this late stage of pregnancy. Now here's why it's going to get complicated, because we can take these two insights about human development and stick them together, and they run into each other. How are we supposed to resolve the fact that the complexity, awareness, and intentionality line points one direction, and the more deprivation line points the other direction? How are we supposed to resolve this conflict? All right, now here we go, right into the controversy. Controversy number one is that the moral value of the fetus depends on questions of personal identity. Now, if you've not taken a philosophy class, you should, because philosophy is wonderful, and you should take all the philosophy classes you can. And if you can't take philosophy classes, you should watch philosophy YouTube videos. But if you have taken one, you probably know that the puzzles of personal identity over time are among the most difficult philosophical problems there are. What is it that makes an individual at one moment identical to the same individual at a different moment? What is it that makes me now the same being as me now? What are the connections between those two things? How far back do they go? How far into the future do they go? Welcome to the philosophy of personal identity. If you look over the history of philosophy, and when I say this, I do not mean only Western academic philosophy. I mean, when you look at philosophical and religious traditions across the globe, across time, there have been 4 proposals that have been the dominant answers to the question, what makes an individual the same individual over time? They are continuity of body, continuity of brain, continuity of sentience, and continuity of rational personality. Now, some of you are suspicious. Where's the soul? Here's the soul. But here's the thing. I don't want to talk about souls. And it's not because I don't like souls. I love souls. I believe in souls. But I don't think that souls contribute anything to this conversation at all. And the reason why is because your concept of soul is going to align with one of these other views. So say, for instance, that you're an Aristotelian or a Thomist, a follower of Thomas Aquinas. Your definition of a soul is that it is the form of a body, right? So if you believe in a soul in that way, we're already going to be talking about it when we talk about continuity of body. You might also appeal to souls to explain the nature of subjectivity or the nature of free will and how we act independently or how we act rationally. And that's fine, but those issues are going to come up when we talk about sentience and when we talk about rationality. I at least don't see any way that souls help adjudicate this debate. That I don't see how they introduce new information that we can't handle by talking about these other 4 factors. So I'm going to take them out. One of the intriguing upshots of this is that the abortion issue doesn't have to be a religion issue. All of the things we're talking about here can be talked about independently of whether or not there are supernatural entities of any kind. Not that that's all religion is. It's complicated. Everything's complicated. I am going to mention religion at a couple of other points, but by and large, I think we can have this conversation without talking about religion. So let's just work our way through these different views and see how they play out when it comes to the question of abortion. Let's say you have a continuity of body view. Well, when did the biological organism come into existence? The most plausible answer, all things considered, is at the moment of fertilization. It is complicated. We'll talk about the complication a bit later on, but by and large, I think this is the best way to make sense of the continuity of body view. And even if you disagree with me, that's what many of the people in this debate do believe, so we at least need to have this view on the table. Now, the philosopher in me gets worried about the details of this view. And there's at least one very puzzling case, which is when twinning occurs. Because if you have identical twins, they originate from the same original zygote. And as we all know from algebra, through the property of the transitivity of identity, it can't be the case that person A, twin A, is identical to the zygote, and twin B is identical to the zygote, because then twin A would be identical to twin B. So philosophy puzzles. But let's just bracket that for the time being and keep moving. You might think it's not the whole body that matters, it's only the brain. And that's a sensible thing to think. After all, if I chop off your arms and your legs and your torso and your face and your ears, but your brain is still going, then you might think you're still you, right? Those other parts of you aren't necessary, so maybe you just are a brain. Now, if you just are a brain, then of course it matters when the brain comes into existence. And this is a blurry line, but the beginnings of brain development are going to be at roughly the 5-week mark. So we're going to be into the 2nd month of pregnancy before we actually get enough differentiation that we can talk about a distinct brain as an organ. It's of course possible, and I have this kind of blurry line on the other end, that your brain dies before the rest of your body does, right? So there's going to be some issues at the end of life as well when it comes to when your brain stops working. This might actually lead you to the next view, which is the continuity of sentience view. So maybe it's not the body that matters, and it's not the brain that matters, but it's the stuff that the brain does that matters. It's the experience. That's what sentient is. That's what sentience is. It's the experience of subjectivity, in particular, the experiences of pleasure and pain, enjoyment and suffering. So when does that happen? Once again, a bit of a blurry line, but we're not really seeing that in fetal development until about the middle of the pregnancy. And of course, it is possible that you lose that before your body dies. So there's going to be a blurry line at the end of life as well. And you might think that actually sentience isn't enough, that what really you need in order to explain what makes the killing of humans a big deal is rationality. You need a connected rational psychology. You need the development of a continuous personality that has impact into the future, that develops hopes and dreams and plans and purposes. And that's not going to go back very far as this kind of a chart goes. Obviously, this chart is not to scale. Most of life happens in that adult phase. But on a scale, on this chart at least, it's not going to go back all the way, even into the womb, because we don't have strong psychological connections to even our very young post-born selves, right? I only remember things from when I was 4. That's pretty common. About 3, about 4 is when you start to have a continuous rolling set of memories and personality traits that continues to shape and develop over time. All right, so those are the 4 views that have typically been brought up. We're going to end up focusing really just on 3 of them, but you can expand from there in ways that I hope are kind of obvious. All right, so there's the 4 views of personal identity that have been the most dominant and how they relate to which stages of human development we see those occurring. Here's the next controversy. The moral value of the fetus depends on the relationship between actuality and potentiality. So some people have suggested that what matters about a thing isn't just the way it is, that's the actuality, but the way it could be, the way it will be, the way it might be, that's your potentiality. So I'm going to track that by talking about species. So we're going to go through each of the different 4 things. At the top, we're going to talk about potentiality, because potentiality is tied to species. The potentials that you as an individual have are related to the kinds of things you are. Yes, I know, species is complicated. We need to keep working with it anyways. Remember the complexities and keep going. So we're going to start at the end and work our way this direction. The potentiality and actuality of rational psychology. So rational psychology in an individual human develops, as we said, at about 3 or 4. But there are certain species that are capable of that development and others that aren't. This is a scientific question, really, and open to some dispute. And it can also be a matter of degree. So you can think, for instance, that chimpanzees exhibit a certain amount of this kind of rational psychology, but maybe not quite as much as we do. And eventually, as you work your way down, you're going to be able to say, no, like fish don't have it. But there's going to be some blurry lines in the middle where we need to do pretty hard work to figure out what kind of rational psychological capacities are there. What about sentience? Also controversial. Beings like us, humans, chimpanzees, we're all sentient. Dogs are sentient. Birds are sentient. It's going to be kind of an open question whether fish are sentient. It's not an open question whether plants and bacteria are, right? So once again, up to science to do the kind of work we need to do to determine whether or not these beings have the capacity to experience enjoyment and suffering. It's going to have at least something to do with the structure of their brains, but not just having a brain. It's got to be a brain of a certain kind with certain kind of functions. You can talk about just brains. And if you do that, that gets pretty straightforward. So fish have brains, but so do earthworms. And so you're going to end up having a pretty broad scope for brains at the species level. And of course, if you just talk about living bodies, all living things have living bodies, including things like bacteria. All right. Now that we've got that in place, I can introduce you to the three views that I really want to spend the rest of the time talking about, because they're hybrid views. They're views that make claims not only about actuality, but also about potentiality. So here's combined view number one. This is my view, and this is the standard pro-life kind of a view. The properties that matter are rational being properties, rational agent properties, but they matter not only when they are actual, also when they are potential. So the actual bodies of potentially rational beings, those are the things that it is very serious to kill, that have a very high moral cost involved in killing them. Now, you might disagree with me. And in fact, there is a very common, very widely held, and very sensible view called the actuality of sentience view. Now, the actuality of sentience says what matters is sentience, and it doesn't matter when sentience is merely potential. It only matters when sentience is actual. This is a view that is commonly held among, say, animal rights defenders, right? The idea here is it doesn't matter if you have the capacity to develop sentience, you have to actually be sentient. And there's some really nice theoretical reasons for believing this, because if something can experience suffering and enjoyment, then enjoyment is good for it, and suffering is bad for it. And so you do the good things, and you don't do the bad things, and everything works out nice and tidily. You don't have to get into all this messy stuff about potentiality. Of course, it's not merely about these beings here. This is also going to get you into the argument for vegetarianism, where there are certain kinds of animals that we're inclined to kill in order to eat them, and people are going to object to our killing them in order to eat them in virtue of their being sentient. One more view, which is an actuality of rational psychology view. So essentially this says, like the first view, rational psychology is what matters, but like the second view, only actuality matters. So now you're going to get these beings where really only humans or very human-like creatures, it's very serious to kill, and only in the phases where they exhibit the exercise of rational psychology. So that gives us three views. And as you can see right away, there are direct implications for the abortion issue, right? Only if you hold the first kind of view is killing an early term human fetus going to be a big deal. If you hold the second kind of a view, because early term human fetuses don't have sentience, killing them won't be a big deal. And if you look at the third view, you might think, wait a minute, does that imply that killing infants isn't a big deal? And the answer is no, it doesn't imply that. What it does imply is that killing infants isn't a big deal on behalf of the infants. So people who have the third kind of view criticize infanticide by appealing to the indirect value of infants. That is, the value placed on them by others. So the destruction of an infant is like the destruction of a great piece of public art. It belongs to all of us, and what makes it bad is not how you impact that being, but how you impact the beings that care about it. So I've shown you these three views, and I've suggested that the first view is the one that I like, but I haven't really told you why. In order to see that, I want to look at end-of-life cases, because the principles we're considering here are the principles that govern the killings of humans in general. It's not only applicable in abortion cases. Let's consider three hospital patients. The first one is conscious, the second two aren't. But there's an important difference between the second two. The first one is likely to recover, and the second one isn't. I still want you to imagine that both of these cases are people who are in deep levels of unconsciousness. You could perform surgeries on them and things like that. So here's the thing. If you look at either the actuality of sentience or the actual of rational psychology view, there's only one of these patients that meets those conditions, the first one, the one who is conscious. Neither the recoverable nor the unrecoverable patient is sentient or rational at this moment.
So you can't actually only appeal to actual sentience or actual rational psychology. There has to be some kind of potential involved. This view, my view, automatically gets the answer right. Both the conscious and recoverable patients are wrong to kill. The unrecoverable one might not be. You could, for instance, harvest the organs of a person who has a dead brain. So we can see that there's some reason to talk not only about the properties and when they exist, but about the objects that have those properties. Combined view number 1 suggests that that object is the body, the continuous biological organism that began at the moment of fertilization. You could substitute in the brain. This would be a different view, one we haven't really considered, where what matters is the object, the brain, and the fact that it has potentially rational properties. I think this is actually a really interesting view, one that has a lot of things going for it. We're going to ignore it for the purposes of this conversation for the following reason. These two views do have different implications for the morality of abortion, but they're subtle, because the brain starts to develop generally before women know that they're even pregnant. So while there might be some philosophical reasons for preferring brains to bodies, for defining continuity over time, we're going to ignore those differences here. Let's move on from all this conversation about metaphysics to talking about principles of ethics directly. The moral significance of abortion depends on our obligations to care for others. Here, the most dominant paper that has had a tremendous amount of influence is this paper called A Defense of Abortion by Judith Jarvis Thompson. Charmingly, this is her official Wikipedia picture. I don't know how that happened. And she has developed this argument, this thought experiment that's called the violinist example. And here's how the violinist example works. Thompson, for the purposes of the argument, grants what I'm calling combined view 1. She grants that a human being has a full-blown right to life from the moment of conception all the way up through its natural death. She grants that for the sake of the argument. She doesn't believe it. She believes something more like combined view 3. But the claim is that even if you hold combined view 1, you can defend the morality of abortion, her claim is, in all cases, or at least in nearly all cases. Here's how the argument works. There's a guy. He's a violinist. He's an especially great violinist. And unfortunately, he has a problem with his kidneys. And so his life is likely to end prematurely unless something is done about it. Because this is a philosophy thought experiment, it's ridiculous. So what happens is the Society of Music Lovers hunts around to find a compatible donor, kidnaps that person, and then ties them to a table and connects them to the violinist. Now, this connection has a couple of different features. First of all, it allows the kidnapped person to process the bodily fluids that the violinist's body can't process on its own. It's hooked up in such a way that if the kidnapped person disconnects from the violinist will die. But if the kidnapped person stays connected to the violinist for 9 months, then the violinist will go free and be able to live a normal, healthy life. So the claim that Thompson wants to make is that the kidnapped person has the right to disconnect from the violinist, allowing the violinist to die, even though the violinist is obviously a person with a full-blown right to life, just like yours and mine. Now, obviously, this is supposed to be parallel in interesting ways to a pregnancy, right? That if we grant that the fetus has a full-blown right to life, just like yours and mine, then the fetus is like a violinist. In fact, doesn't have functioning kidneys, so the woman's body has to process the fluids on behalf of the fetus, and if the fetus gets disconnected, it will die. What's the principle motivating Thompson's analysis of this case? It's this. Her claim is that the right to life does not imply the right to use another person's body to stay alive. So she can grant that the violinist and the fetus have a full-blown right to life and block that that right to life implies a right to use the woman's body to stay alive, because the right to life doesn't imply this other right, the right to use someone's body to stay alive. Now, let's say that you don't like this principle.
you want to throw this principle out because you want to reply to Thompson by criticizing this principle. Here's the most straightforward way to criticize this. Just change the does not to a does. The right to life does imply the right to use another person's body to stay alive. Now, you're not going to be able to make a claim like this without making a bunch of other claims. This doesn't have anything to do with exclusively pregnancy. It's going to introduce complexities about the rights to use other people's bodies across the board. Now, before we get directly to that, I'm going to change it just a little bit to this. Let's not talk about bodies for a moment. Let's just talk about personal property. Is it the case that human beings' full-blown rights to life, whenever they develop, imply the right to use another person's property to stay alive? Now, this is a principle that I, at least, am fairly sympathetic towards, and I'm in good company with our good friend St. Thomas Aquinas. Whatever a man has in superabundance is owed of natural right to the poor for their sustenance. So Ambrosius says, and it is also to be found in the Decretium Gratiandi, the bread which you withhold belongs to the hungry, the clothing you shut away to the naked, and the money you bury in the earth is the redemption and freedom of the penniless. That rabid lefty, Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so you might accept this principle. I might accept this principle, but you should recognize that if you accept even this principle, which is only about property, not about bodies, it's going to have massive implications. It essentially means that whatever you have that you don't need belongs to somebody else that needs it to stay alive. Complicated and not very consistent with the way that we actually deal with economics and wealth in the real world. Let's go back to this claim. Even if you like the claim about property, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to buy this claim about bodies. It would follow from that you have a mandatory moral obligation to donate your extra kidney. And if you get around to legally enforcing those mandatory moral obligations, as of course is proposed with some kinds of abortion policies, you would have the possibility, at least, of public policies that require you, by coercion, to donate your extra kidney. And I suspect that's not something that many people would be sympathetic towards. So let's grant her the principle, as she stated it. The right to life does not imply the right to use another person's body to stay alive. Once again, the violinist has a full-blown right to life, but it doesn't follow from that the violinist has a right to the woman's body to stay alive. Is this going to work in pregnancy cases? Can we say that the fetus has a full-blown right to life, but it doesn't give the fetus a right to use the woman's body to stay alive? That's going to get into some more complexities. In particular, we're going to have to ask the question, how did the woman get pregnant in the first place? Did she get pregnant by rape, or was it by voluntary sex? This is really important because the violinist example is most analogous to a rape case. The woman was kidnapped and hooked up to the violinist against her will without her knowledge, right? That's more like rape. In a voluntary sex case, you might think, is different. So Thompson introduces two modified versions, clarified versions of her principle to discuss this puzzle. Here's the weak version of her claim. The right to life does not imply the right to use another person's body to stay alive unless that person knowingly took risks that create a life-death dependency. The strong version takes away the unless. The right to life does not imply the right to use another person's body to stay alive, even if that person knowingly took risks that create a life-death dependency. Now, as a matter of fact, in her paper, this is the principle she wants to defend. But she recognizes that even if she only gets the weak principle, that still justifies abortion in cases of rape, even if the fetus has a full-blown right to life, just like yours and mine. If we accept even the weak principle and combined view 1, it should still be morally permitted for the woman to have an abortion. What about the voluntary sex case? That's going to make us think about this principle. So, can it be the case that you engage in a risky activity that you know might create another being or place another being into a life-death dependency and then not owe them the use of their body to stay alive? Thompson thinks you can do such a thing. I disagree with her. I'm not the only one who disagrees with her. People like Marianne Warren, a very famous defender of the morality of abortion, also disagree with her. Thompson goes through another set of very famous examples that are even stranger than the violinist example. What you would need to see is the people seeds example. I'm not going to go through it. Go read her paper. I'm going to give you my own silly example, the dancing at the Grand Canyon example. So let's say that you had a relationship with your grandmother, such that you used to dance with her in front of the fireplace. And over the fireplace was a photograph of the Grand Canyon. And you jokingly referred to this as dancing at the Grand Canyon. Now eventually, as is the case, your grandmother gets old and she passes away. So you decide that the way you'd like to honor her life is by traveling to the Grand Canyon at the point where the picture was taken and dancing around in celebration of her. So you get there and you start to dance around in this very important personal ceremony that's related to your relationship with your grandmother. And you're not a great dancer, but you're fine. And you have no expectation that you'll be putting yourself or anybody else at risk. But unbeknownst to you, there's a stone on the ground that is loose. And when you step on it, you spin and you hit another person and you knock them over the edge of the Grand Canyon. That person, fortunately, reaches out and grabs onto you. You're wearing a tie or a belt or a scarf or something, and they hold on to that to prevent themselves from falling over the edge. Now let's make this very uncomfortable for you, very painful for you, maybe even somewhat scarring to you. Maybe it's rubbing against your skin in such a way that you're experiencing quite a bit of pain and might even experience a certain amount of bodily deformation. Furthermore, the fact that this person is hanging from you increases the risk of your own falling over the edge of the Grand Canyon. Not super high, but high enough that it is a concern to you. If this principle is correct, then you can, with a good conscience, cut that line and let the person fall to their death because you owe them nothing. To be fair to Thompson, she believes that in a case like this, you might have what are called Good Samaritan obligations to help the person hanging from you. Those are our general purpose obligations to help somebody in need, but they aren't the same as the obligations that we generate through our voluntary intentional actions. The way I've constructed this case, though, it's not clear that Good Samaritan obligations will be sufficient. Generally speaking, your own bodily discomfort or harm or putting yourself at greater risk of death are not included in Good Samaritan obligations. I conclude at least that this claim, Thompson's strong claim, is too strong. It gets us off the hook for obligations that it shouldn't get us off the hook for. You might still think that this claim, her weak claim, is too weak, that it would generate too many obligations in cases where we don't want them. Of course, it's up to you at this point and the long process of doing ethics to figure out some alternative view. There will be some cases, like the Grand Canyon case, where your actions do generate obligations to others who are in a life-death dependency on you, and other cases where they don't. But that's going to be tricky to figure out. You're going to have to do a good amount of work to nail down the details of that. Which brings us to the main conclusion of this section, which is that the abortion issue is by nature controversial because it depends on all of these extremely complex metaphysical and ethical issues in philosophy. What follows from the fact that these issues are so complex? I want to suggest that in recognition of our diverse perspectives, we should legally permit abortions, pre-viability, and in cases involving rape or serious threats to a woman's health. I think it is part of living together in a pluralistic democracy where we allow for freedom of different kinds of worldviews that we must recognize that all three of these views are very well established philosophical perspectives and that it is perfectly reasonable for good, intelligent people to disagree about which of these views is the best. I want to just call your attention again to the sentience view. Whether you agree with this view or not, it's very simple and straightforward. Creatures that can experience pleasure and pain, enjoyment and suffering, have an interest in having those positive experiences and avoiding the negative ones. It also turns out to be the case that when you kill an animal, it doesn't have access to those desirable experiences, so it has a continued interest in survival. And this has led to the whole conversation that we're having these days about animal rights. Even if you don't believe that non-human animals have a right to life, most of us believe that animals have some kinds of rights. At least some animals have some kinds of rights. This is why we ban dog fighting and things like that. It's also worth noting that the people who embrace this kind of view are often very self-sacrificial about it. This is what motivates vegetarianism and veganism. And so it's hard to argue that people embrace this view out of some kind of selfishness, right? People will actually go quite out of their way to live their lives in accordance with these values. And that seems like something that we should be respecting and thinking carefully about. So let's look at a very practical policy suggestion that an actuality of sentience person could take: a ban on pork. Now, here's an additional benefit to the ban on pork. Not only is it the case that pigs are intellectually and socially speaking about as complex as dogs, that we generally think are the kinds of things we shouldn't be killing and eating. It's also the case, and this is one of the places where religion will come up, that only Christianity, among the biggest and most influential religious traditions, has ever believed that eating pork is okay. Judaism, Islam, both specifically ban the eating of pork, and of course, Hinduism, Buddhism, and others specifically ban the eating of animals most of the time, or at least a lot of the time. You can see there's a potential inconsistency here, that some groups are willing to impose their values on others, but will object when those others impose their values back. So I want to look at three kinds of political positions that we could have in this space. After all, this is an important space where we have some disagreement about which things have a right to life. One kind of position would be a pro-choice position, some kind of liberty to act in accordance with different views about the value of some lives, including the unborn and non-human. There's another kind of view that I'll call the narrowly pro-life view that is pursuing strong legal protections for unborn humans, but liberty to act in accordance with different views about the value of non-humans. Right? So this would be anybody that's kind of pushing for abortion bans or restrictions on abortions, but resisting attempts to change the way that we structure our food practices to improve the situations of animals, or even to prevent us from killing animals for food. There is another possible view, which I'll call broadly pro-life, which seeks strong legal protections for all valued lives, including the unborn and non-human. Now, you can see how this has another kind of consistency, right? It says that if there's a certain type of creature, non-humans or unborn humans, that are deeply valued by certain members of our society, then perhaps we should protect those. We should use our legal powers to protect both of those. And so I think that these two positions, what the pro-choice position and the broadly pro-life position, are really the most politically consistent, right? The pro-choice view basically says, if there's some disagreement among the populace about which things have rights, then we'll err on the side of permission. We'll allow people to make those decisions on their own. Whereas the broadly pro-life perspective says, if there's some disagreement among the populace about which things have value, we'll err on the side of caution, and we'll protect both kinds of lives, or all kinds of valued lives. The narrowly pro-life position seems the least defensible of these three. To say that there is some population which values unborn humans, and therefore we should ban those things, is problematic if we don't also recognize that there is some portion of the population that objects to the way that we're treating non-humans, but we don't ban those. I think then if you're both pro-life and pro-animal eating, then you should probably embrace this principle. You should probably realize that it's in everybody's interests that we have a system of politics that recognizes a diverse variety of perspectives, even on the question of which things have a right to life. Let's say that you, like me, are a person who endorses pro-life values. What are you supposed to do about that? What are you supposed to do about what you consider to be the great tragedy of abortion? Here's what I think you should do. People with pro-life values should focus their efforts on demand-side strategies for reducing abortion rather than supply-side strategies. We should work on ways that we can impact the world such that the desires to have abortions are decreased, not try to restrict access to abortions. Before we go any further, we should look at some of the facts. How many abortions do you think occur? Or rather, I think a more interesting question, how many women choose to have abortions? So frame the question this way. Consider the set of women who transitioned from early fertility until the end of their fertility. What percentage of those women will at some point in their life choose to have an abortion in the United States today? The answer, which was very surprising to me when I learned it, is 1 in 4. Now, that's a big deal. If we are going to try to ban or restrict abortion, we are going to be banning or restricting an action that 25% of the female population of our society have voluntarily engaged in. And that comes with massive consequences. And we need to consider what those consequences are very carefully. I'll give you a little sneak preview. Here's what I think we should be doing about this. Listen to the women who are choosing to have abortions, learn about why they're making those decisions, advocate to improve their situations, and provide them with the resources that they need to do so. I'm going to be appealing to a set of studies that have been done by the Guttmacher Institute. They are clearly an organization that's on the pro-choice side of the spectrum, but the research that they do is statistical research about the occurrence of abortion in the United States. And all I can say on their behalf with regard to the skeptics is that their data is the data that basically all abortion-related organizations use, from the most pro-life organizations like Focus on the Family to many, many others. So the statistics themselves seem to be a broad approach, even if you don't agree with their conclusions. They've done this study in 2014 of the demographics of US abortion patients. And they looked for factors that predict whether or not a person would have abortion, and they measure those in terms of what they call an abortion index. The thing that was the most important factor, the most significant factor overall, was poverty. 75% of the women who choose to have an abortion in the United States are poor or low income. 49% of them are living at less than the federal poverty level, and 26% of them are living between 100 and 200% of the poverty level. That number in parentheses is the abortion index. So the women living below the federal poverty line are 2.5 times more likely than the general population to have an abortion. Likewise, the women between the 100 and 200% line are 1.3 times more likely to have an abortion than the general population. And the women living above that threshold, 200% of the poverty level or higher, are 0.04 times as likely, which means much less likely to have an abortion than the rest of the population at large. There are a number of other contributing factors. I encourage you to go look at the studies themselves, but by and large, here's what we're learning. The women who have abortions are young, they're in their 20s. They're primarily not married. They actually are more likely to be living with somebody else that they're not married to than not living with somebody else. They are disproportionately women of color, and they are disproportionately women with no religious affiliation and women who already have a child. Now, this is statistics, so of course, there are people from all over the spectrum of all of these spectrums who are choosing to have an abortion, but these are predictors of likelihood, and that's important for us to know. All right, so now that we kind of know what the problem looks like, what can we do about it? Here's what we seem to be doing about it. I'm just going to call this the naive pro-life strategy. The naive pro-life strategy says, we've got unwanted pregnancies. There's two possible outcomes, abortions or families. We want it to be families, so block abortions. Here's why that's naive. Because there are already blocks in place over here. Nobody wants to have an abortion. Abortions aren't fun at all. The only reason that women choose to have abortions is because there's something preventing them from making the decision to continue on and form a family, or to continue on and add to their family, depending on the life situation of the people that we're talking about. So this is just far too simple a picture of what's happening. This is probably also too simple a picture, but it's at least a little bit better. So on the abortion side of things, there are two possible outcomes: legal abortions and illegal abortions. And on the family side of things, there are two possible outcomes: thriving families and struggling ones. And obviously the only one that anybody wants are thriving families. Now, I don't want to assume too much about what it looks like to be a thriving family. That might be a classical two-parent family. It might be a single parent who is better resourced to be able to take care of their family. It might be adoption. So the idea here from a pro-life perspective is that the children who are emerging from these unwanted pregnancies will end up in thriving families. But we don't need to say too much about what exactly those families look like, because there are many different kinds of thriving families. So the question now is, given what we understand about abortion, what can we do? Here's what we tend to be actually doing: trying to implement legal restrictions on abortion. Here's why we shouldn't do that. First of all, as I've already stated, it's inconsistent with pluralistic democracy and religious freedom. It's a bad idea to be implementing policies where we see philosophical and religious diversity of opinion. That's the kind of thing that democracy is supposed to be doing, creating areas of compromise so that we can live together with people who we don't agree with. Furthermore, there are reasons to be concerned that these sorts of policies, bans and restrictions on legal abortion, actually aren't very effective at reducing abortion rates. Now, I'm not a statistician who does these kinds of studies. I will point in the direction of some. Here's a lovely article. It's a Medium article called "Abortion Bans Don't Work." I want you to go and read it if you care about these things. If you're a person like me of pro-life values, parts of it will rub you the wrong way. This is common in this debate because people who are talking about pro-choice policies are going to also sometimes have this pro-choice dismissiveness about the values of certain kinds of human lives. But the reason I link you to this article is because it contains many direct links to the studies that have been performed. Studies that show the questionable impact that state restrictions have on abortion rates. We can also see across national boundaries the results of this thing called the global gag rule. When Republican presidents come into office, they tend to restrict funding to international non-government organizations if those organizations are involved in performing abortions. When Democratic presidents come in, they reverse that policy and allow that kind of funding. One effect of this is that we can actually see how the impact of introducing and removing these policies in a culture behaves, what effects that brings about. There are several decent arguments to be made that restrictions on abortions don't actually bring the abortion rates down. What they can do is drive some abortions out of a region, so people will move to other areas where restrictions are less. They might also push abortions underground. And unfortunately, we know that when that happens, especially globally, women are put in unnecessary danger. I understand that these studies are controversial. I encourage you to go look at them yourself. But there does seem to be some reason to believe that these kinds of restrictive policies aren't really very helpful. Another reason to be concerned about banning or restricting legal abortion is that it will create black markets for medical and surgical abortions. Remember that 1 in 4 women through their reproductive years will choose to have an abortion here in the United States. If you make something that popular illegal, you will always create a black market. This is a lesson that we should have learned from our attempts to prohibit the consumption of alcohol. Why did we get rid of this? Because we found out that the attempts to hold this prohibition in place were overall, as a society, far too costly. I think we can easily predict that something similar would happen if we moved from broad access that we have now to constrained access if we had a ban in place. So we shouldn't try to block legal abortions, in part because they will result in illegal abortions, and we don't want those either, so we would have to try to crack down on them. Here's what's going to happen if we try to do that. So first of all, black markets are resilient. They move around. They adapt to their circumstances. Because of this, they're very expensive to fight. This is the real reason why we got rid of prohibition. It's because the cost of fighting the criminal underground that developed wasn't worth it, all things considered. Another reason, which is very important, is that especially at this point in history, self-induced abortion is easy. There's a website out there right now called Plan C, which is essentially providing women with advice on how to obtain 2 medicines that, if they are combined in the right way, will induce abortion at home. If you think that you can ban abortion at this point in history and there won't emerge a massive black market in those drugs, you just don't understand the situation that we're actually in. Also, self-induced abortion can be dangerous, sometimes very dangerous. Not so much with the Plan C kinds of methods, but with the many other kinds of methods that women have resorted to over the history of bans on abortions. Look again at that Medium article for some resources on which kinds of things we've seen the World Health Organization warn us about with regard to the things that women do in their desperate circumstances. Finally, and I think this is one of the most emotionally potent of the reasons, we would end up abusing women who suffer miscarriage. From the outside, we don't know whether the end of a woman's pregnancy is intentional or not. The only way to find out if it was would be to engage in an investigation. And sometimes engaging in that investigation will mean investigating a woman who didn't do anything at all, who lost a pregnancy that perhaps she wanted very much. And this is in no way fictitious. This happens in the real world. We know in other countries where there are abortion bans in place that women who have had miscarriages have been prosecuted and imprisoned for that occurring, even though they did nothing at all. Back to our bigger picture of advanced pro-life strategy. My suggestion is that we don't do either of these things. Does that mean we actually don't do anything at all on the abortion side of things? It might. After all, there are already natural obstacles to abortion. Nobody really wants abortion. People are having abortions because they feel desperate and that they don't have other options. So let's turn our attention the other direction. We should also recognize, of course, that the reason women are choosing abortion is because there are other obstacles here that are preventing them from seeing the continuation of their pregnancy as a live option that they can look forward to and potentially enjoy. So we must figure out how to remove these obstacles as part of our overall advanced pro-life strategy. What can we do specifically? At least 2 things. We can build safety nets that protect women from the difficult circumstances they're trying to avoid. And of course, we can try to prevent unwanted pregnancies in the first place. Let's deal with the second one first. Here's a pro-life defender's favorite way to reduce unwanted pregnancy: abstinence. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a fan of abstinence. I think it's a good idea for people to be careful and cautious about who they engage in sexual relationships with, and they should do that in a way that is mature and thoughtful. Of course, in many ways, abstinence is unpopular. Sex is fun, and people want to do it. So how do you convince them to do otherwise? I think it's interesting that at this point in history, we are seeing some unlikely allies for the abstinence movement. Those of you who are concerned about promoting abstinence, I encourage you to watch this video. This is an interview between comedian Nikki Glaser and another comedian, Whitney Cummings. These are 2 of the raunchiest female comedians there have ever been, with a clear history of promiscuous living. But about 12, 13 minutes into this video, they drop into a long conversation about why it's important not to have sex too early in your relationship because of all the problems that it causes. It's fascinating. Look at it. The alternative to abstinence, of course, is contraception. I understand that there are people who are afraid to introduce contraception into the conversation because it will drive down the abstinence rates. People will just have a lot more sex because they don't have to be worried about getting pregnant. All I have to say to this is if the only reason that your children are remaining abstinent is because they are afraid of pregnancy, you've probably already lost the battle and are likely creating more neuroses in them and not helping them to develop healthy long-term relationships over the long run. The reasons for abstinence shouldn't be based in fear. They should be based in the value on certain kinds of sexual relationships. All right, we need to get a little bit into the technical details of contraception. How does contraception work? I'm not going to do a lot here. Two broad categories. Contraception can prevent conception, and it can prevent implantation. Now, for pro-life reasons, people do not object to the kinds of contraception that prevent conception. After all, if you hold the kind of view that I'm defending, you think that the new being emerges when the sperm joins the egg. So if you can keep sperm from fertilizing eggs, no problem. At least no problem for pro-life reasons. The concern is with contraception that also prevents implantation. So let's look at the pro-life nightmare, the intrauterine device. Sometimes members of the pro-life community will say that IUDs cause abortions. Whether or not that's true depends on what you mean by the word abortion. IUDs do have two effects. They can prevent fertilization, but they can also prevent implantation. If they operate by preventing implantation, then they lead to the death of a blastocyst. And if you believe combined view 1, then I was once a blastocyst. And raising the probability of blastocyst deaths is morally costly. Even if you think that blastocyst deaths have a moral cost, you probably shouldn't think that that cost is equivalent to abortions at later stages of human development. We could say, and probably should say, that zygote destruction or blastocyst destruction is just much less significant than the destruction of human entities at later stages. After all, once we move a little further along, the blastocyst becomes the origin of both the placenta and the embryo. The embryo develops its own brain tissues. That brain develops the capacity for sentience, et cetera, et cetera. So each one of those stages, you might think, is adding to the moral cost of what's involved. And if that's right, then widespread IUD use would be, all things considered, a much better outcome than abortions of fetuses, even in early pregnancy. Of course, IUDs aren't the only option. There are a number of types of contraception, and any type of contraception that prevents fertilization rather than implantation should be something that people with pro-life values can endorse. Interestingly, there are some emerging contraceptive technologies that operate on men rather than women, which essentially prevent the sperm from leaving the man's body. An interesting feature of these is that they're reversible, maybe even reversible at home. So you could engage in sexual activity without any fear of pregnancy, and you can just open the valve when you decide that you'd like to start a family. Far too much of the contraceptive burden has fallen on women anyways. Maybe those of us with pro-life values should be looking to shift that burden a bit. Make the men do some stuff to prevent pregnancy. All right, so that's it for blocking unwanted pregnancies. What can we do about struggling families? We can promote healthy families. Given the information we looked at earlier, one of the most important things we can do is reduce poverty. I'm not going to get into how to reduce poverty. This is a very hard question. All I can say is it's not sufficient to grow the economy. You have to grow the economy in a way that impacts the poor. And that's not the same thing, and we need to be paying attention to the difference. We want to create supportive communities that support these women who find themselves pregnant when they don't want to be. And we can also pursue private and public funding for a variety of practices like parental leave, childcare, and counseling. I would love to see pro-life businesses hardcore investing in these kinds of things. If we really believe that the solution to abortion or the solution to poverty in general is stronger family structures, then we need to be investing in those family structures. We need to be taking seriously the fact that long-term relationships are hard and resourcing their success. Conclusion. Being pro-life does not require repealing Roe versus Wade. It does not require supporting bans or restrictions on abortion, and it does not require alliance with the Republican Party. If you look at the history of the abortion rate over time, this is what you see. Now, this is a bit of a difficult graph to understand, but I'll do my best. This is two things at once: the abortion ratio, that is the ratio of the number of pregnancies to the number of abortions, and the abortion rate included. The same basic shape you see in both metrics. You see an increase in abortion at the beginning. That's right after Roe versus Wade gets passed and legal abortion gets ramped up. And then you see a steady decrease after that. Now, sometimes the claim gets made that the abortion rate goes up during Republican presidencies and down during Democratic ones. And that's not quite right. There's a steady downward slope the entire time. And that's for a whole number of reasons. I don't know if you can justifiably say that Democratic presidents are more successful at bringing the abortion rate down. I know for a fact that you cannot say that Republican presidents are better at bringing the abortion rate down. This is a place where the Republican Party is honestly manipulating the pro-life community. They're dangling out in front of us the promise of eradicating abortion when they have no capability to demonstrate that they have done that. And as we've seen, even a full ban on abortion at every stage might not bring the abortion rate down at all. It might just push them all underground. And then we would lose all access to the information of what's happening, and we would pat ourselves on the back that we had successfully saved lives when we might have done nothing of the sort. Pro-life can mean something very different. It can mean convincing rather than coercing. It can mean listening, learning, advocating, and resourcing the women who are currently feeling trapped by their unwanted pregnancies. It can mean changing our community, business, and political practices to promote the choice of life. And it can mean, although it doesn't necessarily mean, voting for Democratic candidates. We know that reducing poverty and increasing access to healthcare and childcare and parental leave and things of that sort are relevant to promoting pro-life values. I understand that there's a lot of issues. I'm not going to try to address all those issues. They're all really hard. And I don't want to pretend that politics is simple. It isn't. I'm just saying that being pro-life doesn't mean voting for one party or the other. It means doing the hard work of actually figuring out which ways we have of bringing abortion rates down while still respecting the diversity of perspectives that we have across the populace. I'm pro-life, and I vote pro-choice. I think this is a perfectly consistent position, and unfortunately one that doesn't have a very good name at the moment. So I'll make one up. I'm pro-choosing life. I think this gets at all the things that we've been discussing. You can have very traditional pro-life values and still believe that it's important for us to live together in a society with people who do not share those values. You can believe that it's important to bring abortion rates down and do that in a way that doesn't require legal coercion, that improves the lives of the women who are currently choosing to have those abortions. Another handy feature of the term pro-choosing life is that it makes a really lovely hashtag.